Just like that. All right, well, this is week 4 for those of you keeping score. And we are looking at the city of Jericho tonight. That should be interesting. And I know we're walking right from Ararat to Sodom, and Joshua's not between those for all you Bible scholars. But when I say Jericho, you say Joshua, right? And the wall, when we talk about the walls of Jericho, we think of them falling down. Yeah, tonight is about them going up and what that led to. Last week we were in Catalhoyuk, a place in south central Turkey, and on the time scale coming from Noah to Abraham, we kind of made a couple of jumps. We'd gone to Abu Hurairah first in Syria, where because of how God planted those people along the Euphrates River, and then turned off the heat in the world, humans went from hunter-gatherers to settled foragers to accidental cultivators, and a couple of steps down the path toward agriculturists. At Catalhoyuk, we saw last week that they started to get it right, and humans started living together in much larger groups. And we're talking thousands at that point, but we're also talking about an open city where the buildings had no doors, and we can interpret that a number of different ways. But as you saw, it was fairly pretty, probably smelled horrible, but that lasted for about 1,200 years. And so now we're taking the next step. So we had the first village, then we had the first town, and tonight we're going to look at the first city. And its wonderful history. What I've done here is I've superimposed old Jericho, and by old I mean probably Joshua's Jericho, on top of the actual mound and modern Jericho. Modern Jericho comprises 2 Jerichos, the old Jericho and the Jericho of Jesus' day. And so what we're going to learn here is that there's a lot more to Jericho than just those walls falling down. In tonight's agenda, we'll always give the first word to God in the book of Joshua. Then we'll look at our sources. We'll move along the way following our ancestors as humanity moves into Canaan from the safety of the Euphrates and Tigris River and for actually settling down, and the beginning of trade routes and crossroads. We'll look at the world's first city, which is in fact Jericho. We'll look at the importance of Jericho in the Bible, and then the importance of Jericho in human development, because it factors very much in our history and in what we see today in city life. We'll look at Jericho from a strategic and even tactical vantage point to see why it was so important, and why, despite curses that your first and last born would die if you rebuilt that city, people kept rebuilding that city. They just couldn't stop themselves. And then we'll look at the wonder of Jericho's walls, and it truly is amazing, considering what resources they had. Then we'll look into the lives of the residents of Jericho and see what that experience was like. We were really able to do that great last week with Catalhoyuk, if you remember. I mean, they actually rebuilt some of the houses just so anthropologists could go inside and take what the archaeologists found and actually build it, and then realize nobody could live in there from the modern era. They choke. But it's cool that you can actually see complete recreations. We don't have that at Jericho. We don't have it for a couple of reasons. Basically because Jericho had something that these other places we've looked at so far didn't have: bedrock, right? And Jesus' words about building on the rock versus building on the sand, that's why Abu Hurairah is not there around anymore. That's why Catalhoyuk was basically protected. They built on dirt. They didn't know any better. And then they built on the foundations of the previous houses. Foundations is the wrong word. Walls of the previous houses. We actually get real construction with Jericho. And that's why it lasts as long as it does. Then from there, we'll look at humanity and warfare, the fortress mentality. What we saw what happened when humans went from living in a village to living in a town, right? No warfare, but lots of minor injuries that were clearly inflicted by cooking utensils around domestic disputes. Okay, we're not talking about arrows and heads, but we are talking about those clay balls used to cook things being clearly thrown at each other. This takes it to the next step. Here, we'll see that material entanglement I've been talking about since fall really start to work its way into our hearts, which is why, especially in the New Testament, Jesus speaks so much about how we handle money, because money is the thing we're most entangled with. But we'll actually see that happening tonight as human beings really start to understand what having more resources than the other folks means. Then we'll look at Jericho and Judgement through history, because it was more than just those walls coming down. God used Jericho as an object lesson a lot. Didn't realize it before I was doing the work for this class. And we'll talk to our conclusions and then look at what we're going to study next week. So the first time Jericho is mentioned in scripture is not in Joshua, it's in Numbers. Moses knew about Jericho. Everybody knew about Jericho. They didn't always talk about it, but the fact is it's quite popular in the Bible, in the Old Testament and New. But in Numbers 22, the first occurrence we read, and the children of Israel set forward and pitched in the plains of Moab on this side of the Jordan by Jericho, which means right across the Jordan River from Jericho. This week's sources, I thought they'd be a lot thinner than last week, but it's actually pretty good. I found some wonderful stuff. Jericho is on the list to become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but it's still being talked about. They filed all their applications, but unlike Catalhoyuk, it's not on the list yet, but there's still a lot of good research. And there's the Aju, or however you say it in, I guess, Arabic, Jordan River Valley Eco Center. They do a great job doing preservation work in the entire lower Jordan Valley. I would presume on both sides of the river, which we know is two different countries. And so they're a great resource. And of course, all the usual suspects, right? But humanity moves into Canaan. Humanity grew up along these two rivers, coming down from the Caspian Sea, where Ararat is, worked our way down. As long as it rained, we liked it and we stayed there. As soon as humans started to get south enough that there wasn't so much rain, we didn't have irrigation, we didn't have cisterns. So when water gets light, you go back north, especially as the climate is changing over time. And we talked last week about the stability of the climate being a huge impactor on how fast humans continue to develop and societies, of course. And but what we find is that even though what we call the Natufians, which would be those very, very early Neolithic hunter-gatherers, they went all up and down the coast. They settled on the Sea of Galilee, which is actually right up in here, as the ice retreated and that very nice area was formed. But they started to make their way south along the Jordan River. Of course, once you get to the Dead Sea, no one's going to have a farm on the Dead Sea back then, right? A little bit of problem with salt. But Jericho turns out to be a very good place for folks to start to settle. And it becomes literally a crossroads between east, west, north, south, especially this north, south here. But that will eventually extend into the Nile Delta, where society is still thousands of years from getting stable. And what's going on in here as we're in about that 9,000 to 10,000 BC time period, as we know from our previous weeks, and Catalhoyuk, that it's a bit of a stretch to come down here, but while things were wet after their ice retreated, that's what people started to do. So Jericho, as far as historians can understand, is in fact the world's first city. Well, what's that mean? And I should say, this is modern Jericho is behind, and this is what's left of Jericho in front. It's not the full extent of it. You can't quite see it, but you got then hills that continue to rise up in the background. Excuse me, but you can see in a place that's known for being very desert-like, you know why it was called the City of Palms. And that's actually what it's called in the New Testament. So What's it mean to be the first city? Well, the first permanent settlement happens between 9500 and 9000 BC. So right up there with the edge of the Abu Huraira village that we first talked about, living through kind of the same stuff. It's a 4-hectare settlement. That's about 430,000 square feet. 12 foot high would be basically the walls that they first built. And those walls would be about 6 feet of stone wide. So that's really going to be the differentiator from where we say village to town to city. It's a city when you can protect it, when you can keep it, which means a wall. Humanity is actually driven here to this protected location by the Younger Dryas. If you remember, in fact, we're going to see it in a minute. The Younger Dryas is a period after the ice, after the floods, when everything is green and lovely and people get used to that and they spread out. And then something else happens. Again, as best we know, it's a meteor, actually a whole bunch of them all over the Northern Hemisphere that basically set the clock back and put us into almost like a mini ice age, except it's not very many. It's a few hundred years. And civilizations like Abu Huraira just completely fall apart for the large part. In Catalhoyuk, a lot of the folks left. But we also see that God used this period, this drying out period, to get people who were very comfortable living with whatever grows and whatever comes by on migration. It's like, well, you don't know how much rain you're going to get. It's kind of chilly. Maybe we ought to start seeing if we can bring things closer. And that's what leads to cultivation. That's what leads to the storage of food. It leads people to say, we're not going to wait for the migration. But again, we went over all this last week, and we can walk through that process online in the video if you'd like. So where they settle, where they get caught when things get cold and dry during the Younger Dryas, is a very well-watered plain. Again, it's beautiful, it's fertile, and it sits down from the mountains. So it's actually protected with the Jordan River about a mile away, and spring. So the nice thing about being down from mountains, right, is that the water that's collected up there tends to work its way down. And so the springs all through this area are just wonderful. But it's about 3,500 feet below where Jerusalem is. The population during what we call the pre-pottery Neolithic, PPNA, which will be the earliest part of human society before the invention of pottery. Pottery changes everything, as we know, as we've talked about in previous classes. It's about 2,000 to 3,000 people, and probably about double that in the PPNB, which is the last period before pottery. It's when people are actually experimenting with clays in a way that gives them more utility, but isn't a very portable, non-brittle pot. But we see the time frames here. So we're about 1,000 years after Catalhoyuk at this point, and a lot of what we saw in Catalhoyuk last week we're going to see here as well. In the PPNB, we're finally getting to herding. It was mostly cereal agriculture and hunting in the PPNA. But then as we move along, we look at the importance of Jericho in the Bible. It is the third most mentioned city in the Bible. And considering Joshua pretty much, figured we're done with a city, no one will ever build a city again. It's like, yeah, they will, because it's so wonderful. So, obviously Jerusalem has to be number one, right? That's the one, for good or bad, that always gets mentioned. Babylon gets mentioned 286 times. And I'm willing to bet part of those mentions are actually, they started to call Jerusalem Babylon as an insult, definitely in the book of Revelation. So I'm not sure how they counted it there. But Jericho is number 3, 64 times. And you would think, okay, well, it's mostly in Joshua, as you would expect, but 31 of the other mentions are throughout the Bible. Sodom, of course, goes away. Bethlehem is mentioned a little bit in the Old Testament, but becomes very prominent in the New Testament, and then, of course, Nazareth. But the importance of Jericho outside of the Bible is also very helpful in helping us understand God's purpose in this plan. And along the way, I'm challenging you to figure out when that little icon up there, the picture starts to change. That's Bronze Age Jericho, kind of at its very height, just before Joshua got into town. That'll change as things move along. But the importance of Jericho in human development is that it is still to this day believed to be the oldest city in the world. Obviously, we're still looking at, you never know what's under the ground until you dig it all up. But we call it Epipaleolithic, which is that 12,000 BC, remember the first place we studied, Göbekli Tepe. From that period to about 11,500, maybe even 11,000, maybe a little later, that's the Epipaleolithic, when we're going from being pure hunter-gatherers to being somewhat settled. And so that's when Jericho first gets settled. It also, as far as the firsts, it's probably the oldest municipal granary in history. And that becomes important because as we looked at these other villages and towns, everything was in the house, right? Everything was in the house. This is the first time there's shared storage. There's so much surplus that we need a municipal storage area. Well, to have municipal anything, you need politicians. You need municipal workers. You need municipal workers. And of course, someone thinks they're in charge. The first example of massive stone walls surrounding an ancient Neolithic settlement around 8,000 BC. Remember, that makes it 10,000 years ago. So that's when the walls first go up. And the walls of Jericho represent the earliest technology that can be ascribed unequivocally to purely military purposes. For a while, they said, oh no, the walls, they were there because that area sometimes floods and the walls would take, it's like, so does a ditch. Okay. When you see what goes into these walls, you're like, that's flood control? No, thank you, you know? And even if it started out that way, it very quickly became something else. Also, the first tower appears in Jericho behind the wall, and it's 28 feet tall and has an internal staircase of 22 steps. This is the first time we've heard of steps, right? Up till now, it's been ladders, right? We've actually got stone steps inside, not outside, which is also pretty interesting. So a lot of quick thinking people are starting to figure this out. I mean, this doesn't get done by Neolithic folks just thinking we should do something, right? This needs architects, this needs designers, this needs resources, this needs supply chain, especially for these folks. The thing about Göbekli Tepe is they could basically carve it right out of where it was. Catalhoyuk, you use what is almost within reach, mud. But this is a different case. It's also this little picture over there from the Rockefeller Museum is probably the oldest representation of a human face ever discovered. So we see that in this very settled new environment, people have enough time, somebody had enough time to make this thing and didn't have to worry about where his next meal was coming from or her next meal was coming from. And we look at this chart almost every week, right? And last week we looked at it to say, okay, so here's Noah, right? We got the super warm up. We got Göbekli Tepe, the first temple, to show that human beings have been worshiping God as long as there's been human beings, and doing so in very reverent and shared praise and feasting. And then we get Abu Huraira. Abu Huraira exists for a fair amount of time, for sure. We got Catalhoyuk, it's shorter, and we talked about how time compresses as technology advances. But look at old Jericho, and then Herod's Jericho. And Jericho's still a real place today. You know what Jericho's made up of today? Old Jericho plus New Jericho. So it literally probably deserves the title of Eternal City better than Rome or anywhere else, because it's been around almost since the beginning of human civilization. In fact, that's a fair statement, since the beginning of human civilization, because it's in such an amazing place. And again, these are thousands of years, 15,000, 10,000, 5,000 now. But let's look now at the strategic location and value of Jericho. This is what Joshua was looking at. This is what God's lead general himself came down to survey Jericho. And Joshua found him, and they had a little conference about how we were going to do this. But I mean, the heavenly general of God's armies wanted to come down and take a look at the site. But I don't know, I'm going to say before deciding on the battle plan, but maybe to, that's an interesting conversation. We could talk at length about that. But what you'll notice here is that Joshua went right by Jericho when they crossed the Jordan River. And this is the cool thing. So the Battle of Jericho, what we're talking about, like 1400s, 1300 BC, 1400s BC. Look at the highways. Look at all the main highways. They're literally following the same route Joshua did. So there's been one good route to get from A to B for 10,000 years, and it's the route people still take. So it cracked me up when I saw that, this is Joshua's path. Oh, so we just took the one? I mean, what exit, But then you got the other highway right here. So the way of the wilderness and so on, they're still in use today. But it's very strategic because this is a very deep valley. Got a river to run down through it. At the top, you got Sea Galilee. Down here, you've got the Dead Sea, which you think, well, what's that worth? It turns out it's worth a whole lot to a developing civilization. But Jericho sits right on the edge. You probably can barely see this, but this whole area is green in an area that is otherwise beige. That's important because these mountains that run all down here, the hill country as it's called, their water tends to go this way, right? The air comes in from the sea, hits the mountains rain, and it fills these multiple springs that are in this area. So this is a green patch in an otherwise very dry area. But beyond that, there's more to consider. It's a fertile plain watered by actually multiple oases. It overlooks the Jordan Valley. So it sits up, especially with your 28-foot tower. And it gives you a pretty commanding view of anyone who's coming your way, and they're coming uphill to you, meaning you have time to prepare. It controls access to the east to the Jordan River. So anybody coming from this side, they pretty much have to come through you or very near you to get down to the Jordan River or beyond it. To the west, it controls access to the hill country, which Joshua knew, as did Moses. And so that's why Jericho had to be number one on the list of how we're going to conquer the promised land. Also, this is going to happen more about the Bronze Age collapse, but Joshua was a very brilliant strategic general and realized that the hills favored him, the plains favored chariots. And so that also became a thing, is he wanted to stick to the mountains. So having that city right there in the mountains with a potential army inside it was not going to be to his advantage. But a walled city can house, feed, and field an army. Till now, there's no such thing as armies. Up till now, everyone is basically doing the same jobs every day. They might help each other here and there, as we've discussed, but there's, specialization is in its infancy because there's not enough food. So the wonder of Jericho, let me just make sure I didn't skip it, right? So the wonder of Jericho's walls as they were. This is the city that Joshua found. And by this time, they'd really gotten the wall thing down. The houses are very similar to what we would see, up until the 1900s, maybe even later, with adobe, if you will. But you see, you control entrances, you've got two walls, which together make it look enormous. A giant ditch that they dug. So basically they're using the earth as a wall, then a wall. They control the two main points of access. No way you're getting up those without taking a whole lot of fire. And the way they're sitting, then they have the mountains to their back, which protects them, and it has a very commanding view. The wonder of Jericho's walls as they are today is also still pretty impressive. Okay, there's no forklifts, okay? That wall is at least 12 feet high. And that's just the base that's been uncovered by the archaeologists. Archaeologists they've been digging at Jericho since about 1907. They've done more damage than they've done good things because they kind of cut their teeth on this. But this is what's left of Jericho's lower wall to this day. And it's still holding together, which is pretty remarkable, considering, being a freestanding wall. But as we look deeper into that, we see that it's actually built from stones hauled from the banks of the Jordan River more than a mile away. Remember what I said about Jericho and the Jordan? It's all downhill, and then it's all uphill with those stones. There's no beast of burden, okay, to help you. It's people and rope. Maybe rollers, maybe other things, but it's pretty much wood, stone, and you wouldn't want to use stone to move stone. Yeah, that's very impressive. It's 4 to 5 meters high, surrounded by a deep ditch. The tower, we said, about almost 9 meters tall, with an internal staircase that we talked about. The scale and sophistication displays a degree of confidence and collaboration we've never seen anywhere on Earth before. And this means that we must have had specialized workers to power the beginnings of what would become an urban civilization. I can't imagine the town meeting where they took a vote on this, but the archaeologists have looked at this, anthropologists, and figured out how many workers it would take working for how long to do this. And it would be hundreds of folks that had to be fed. They weren't hunting, they weren't farming. They were being fed out of the surplus. And that also led to professional classes. So as we've seen from that wonderful piece of art, we've got artisans, merchants, engineers, priests, and we'll start to see the rise of idolatry here as well. And of course, the emergence of ruling elites. Until like 5 o'clock tonight, I was unable to find a good representation of what the houses would have looked like in the early period in Jericho. But when you look at this lower part, you go, okay, that looks like what we've seen in the village. It looks like what we've seen in the town. It's nice. I take some issue with that kind of fabric. Not for a while, but they wouldn't look as nice in animal skins, would they? But then you got that. It's like the Empire freaking State Building. In the middle of a rainforest. You go, what the heck? What is that? And then we've got these massive walls. And they're overlooking this very pastoral scene that you could see anywhere in primitive societies. But you see the contrast. It's like, how in the heck did these people do this? That's the practical side of it. So as we look into the details of their lives, we see circular houses made from mud, brick, and plaster. Okay, we've seen those. We've seen those in the past. A little better than Abu Hurayra, not quite as nice as Calhoya. But the thatch lets the smoke go out. That's how that works, and that actually makes it more waterproof, as long as it doesn't catch fire. Indoor fire pits for cooking and stone querns for grinding flour. Last week we had ovens, right? Those ovens were great, except they filled the place with smoke. If you actually cook over an open pit, the smoke goes through this a lot better, but it means you don't get to use your roof as a second floor. Stone querns, that kind of thing, is around for a long time. It means you spend a lot of time grinding flour. There's no pottery, but they kept seeds and pulses, a kind of cereal in baskets and skins, or in silos made from mud and straw. And this is one of the examples of human beings saying, we got to do something to store all this stuff. Remember the parable of Jesus, right? The wealthy farmer, right, who has the best harvest of his life. And what's he say? I'm going to have to tear down my barns and build new ones, right? So that's basically where we find ourselves here. Is they have so much stuff that every basket is full. Every corner is full. The mice are everywhere. You've got to come up with some way to store this because we've had such a wonderful harvest. The tools that we find are the things we expect. Spears and nets for fishing down in the Jordan River. So they have a very varied diet. Flint-tipped arrows and sickles for reaping the fields. That's cool. We even find what looks like loom weights, although they could have been net weights. It's hard to know. So we might even have been getting into primitive weaving. At the end of the PPNB, we probably have looms, but that wouldn't have been for most of the time here when the city was developing. But we also have, for the first time, treasured possessions, people's stuff that they can't part with, the stuff they just can't put on eBay, right? They got blades made with imported obsidian that came from hundreds of miles away. That's the sharpest thing you can imagine. And it's so cool looking. We've looked at it in graphics in other classes, but that's your favorite knife. You just, you got to hang on to that. Someone brought cowrie shells from the Red Sea, and they're colorful and they're nice. Someone made me a nice necklace out of it, and it's my treasure possession. You're gonna bury me with it. So that's wonderful. Turquoise is coming all the way from the Sinai. But I mean, those are the kinds of things we're starting to see, that accumulation of those kinds of things that aren't just, this sickle is so great because I can replace the teeth whenever I want. I'm going to hold on to the sickle forever. That's your favorite tool. This is about things that you have just for the joy of having them. And what happens is trade and even currency start to come out of this, because the question is, what are you going to trade me for what I've brought? And if you want to trade me something you have, and I'm thinking about where I'm going next, I'm thinking, I'll never be able to sell this. They don't want it where I'm going. They already have this. So what does everybody need after food?
Money.
And that is in what form?
Charitable form.
Yes.
Portable.
Yes. Think Dead Sea. Salt. Salt from the Dead Sea. Now, no matter where I came from the Sinai and I'm going up to the Taurus Mountains, what can I take that they went up there? Salt. When I'm going to the Sinai and they already have cool turquoise, so what can I possibly offer them? Salt. The answer is always salt. Salt, salt, salt. And this place is lousy with salt. And on top of that, bitumen, right? Tar. Remember we talked about the sickle last week, the razor that lets you sell razor blades forever, right? Those little teeth, what's holding those little teeth in there? It's basically glue. It's waterproof glue. If you put bitumen on the outside of your basket, it's virtually a pot. You can now carry liquids. Can't cook in it per se because it's flammable. But on the other hand, we've got this stuff that's right there. So we can start to trade things that everybody is going to want no matter where they're coming from. And the trade route, while we saw it on the map, it goes, all the way from the top of the Galilee, all the way down to the Dead Sea. The east and west cuts right through the mountains. They'll take you all the way to the Nile, all the way to the Euphrates and Tigris. So you've got a wonderful north-south contour in the Rift Valley that your city just happens to completely look over. You're that city on a hill. Life in Chalcolithic or the Copper Age Jericho gets a lot different. This looks a lot like what we saw in Catalhoyuk, right? Not so much doors. People live a lot on their roofs, their flat roofs, they gather water and so on. On the inside, again, that's a very hygienic illustration, but you got some storage, right? You can store some stuff in these little baskets you made. Maybe you can use skins, you can store some things in there. This is all good. What do you do when all those things are full? What do you do then? Even if you said we're gonna be charitable and give it to the poor, eventually even the poor aren't hungry anymore. What are you gonna do with that? So life in Chalcolithic Jericho, the only thing you're missing here is the walls. And of course, we do end up with walls, right? Of course, you know how hard it is to find a picture of the walls with the houses where Joshua and company aren't breaking through. But this is actually a really good illustration of that. The houses we kind of just looked at, they would tend to have interior courtyards, but more or less be cheek to jowl. But because you've got two walls, this area in the middle, which started out basically as just a buffer, when they ran out of space for houses here, people started saying, hey, I can live in the lower area and I don't have to climb so much. And so we end up with Rahab's house right there on the side of the wall. And as far as the town municipal officials are concerned, the king, if you will, I don't care if you build your house up against the wall. Fine by me. To me, it's a rampart. I can have my soldiers walk right across it. Now, this wall is only six feet wide, which is that wide. But for the time, that's amazing. But on the other hand, if you got the roof, the roofs of the houses, that works even better, unless you've got a traitor in your midst. But God does in fact choose Jericho as an object lesson, a very, very important object lesson. Because what happened basically is as they became more self-sufficient, we see the rise of cults. We see the rise of local religions. It's basically, if you will, like a city religion, a city god. It's taken that whole, local feel and making it such that it starts to attain religious characteristics. Because they're so agriculturally based, they really would like a guarantee that the crops are going to come up next year as good as they came up this year. And that starts to turn their attention from an almighty unseen God who provides to a God we need to provide on a schedule. Lord, we'll need rains next week. God, what do we need to do? What do we need to give? We've got plenty of money. We've got plenty of treasures. Tell us what we need to do, what we need to build. We'll do it, which is really self-sufficiency. So God destroys this impregnable city with a bunch of herder-gatherers, destroys it completely when it was probably at its most impregnable time, as an illustration to these people. And that's in Joshua 2-6. But God also judges the Israelites, because when the walls fall down and they go in and destroy everything, what does Achan find? Gold, silver, nice clothes. Gold, so what is the practical value of gold and silver? Right? So far, we haven't looked at any people who cared a whit about gold and silver. Not to mention the trouble involved in getting I can't, it's too soft to cut with. It's heavy. Why do I want this? But Achan, right? Achan, who had never seen this kind of luxury, because he wasn't from Egypt. His parents would have been. Achan doing God's will, seeing how God judges with such wrath, still can't help but put the gold and silver bars in his pocket, can he? Put the robe under his shirt. He buries it, and it ends up costing Israel 75 lives, soldiers killed, attacking the next city, Ai. And it's in Joshua 7, and basically what that's going to result in is, in addition to the deaths, it's going to result in a real loss of confidence, and unfortunately, it's going to result in Achan and his entire family and all his possessions being thrown into a valley and stoned to death, which seems really harsh and hard. But the point is, God is trying to give an object lesson about material entanglement, and one of his first soldiers becomes material entangled. Again, a guy who had never worn a silk robe, linen robe, a guy who'd never seen gold and silver, in the first second, right? He has to have it. But when the Babylonians come, after ignoring Jeremiah for years, saying God is going to send the Babylonians to conquer, his own people, because they will not turn from their idolatry. And the king said, "Oh no, God's going to deliver us again. Of course he's going to deliver us again. He's our God. We got a temple right here." And Jeremiah, you don't worship him. What makes you think? I've been telling you that. The guy before me told you that. Why would he protect you now? And when the final king of Judah, which is, Israel goes first, then Judah, when the final king of Judah decides to run away from Jerusalem after ignoring the offers of peace by surrendering, and he runs away, where does he run? Jericho. And that's where he gets caught. And that's literally the last act in the pre-exile world of Israel. So God uses Jericho yet again to exercise his judgment, and only this time it's on his own people, leading to the Babylonian judgment and exile found in 2 Kings and found in Jeremiah. And then even in the New Testament, where we have an evil king, right, tries to kill our Savior and Lord as a baby, right? A horrible man. Where does he end up finding judgment and painful, torturous death? In Jericho, at his winter palace, of course. And that's really the end of Judea. That's virtually the end of Israel. It's a long slope there, but ends in 70 and then 120 AD. And at that point, Israel just becomes a Roman crossroads. But God also uses Jericho in a very positive way. I was going to ask, who do we know in the Bible from Jericho in the New Testament? Zacchaeus, right? Jesus went there. He went there a fair amount. And Jesus did a lot of healing there. But this is the best story from Jericho. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was chief tax collector and was wealthy, right? Wealthy, it's Jericho, wealthy, right? The one equals the other. This is where people fell in love with tangible wealth. But as we cut down to verse 8, but Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." And of course, Jesus praises him profusely in this. But what a great circle. Isn't it wonderful how the symmetry of God works? The place where wealth became a problem for human beings becomes one of the most notable illustrations of Jesus' ministry on how people through faith in him can lose that terrible scourge of envy and covetousness. And of course, Jesus says to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost," even in Jericho. So we're wrapping it up right on time here for a change. Did anyone notice when we made the change to the ruins? It was actually a couple slides ago. From the pretty town too, that's what it looks like today. Of course, it's surrounded by a city. But yeah, that's all that's left of human greed, envy, but where it all began in earnest, in our urban way of life. So Jericho figures quite prominently in God's plan for humanity. The first city becomes a test case for how society will develop. The initial excess of agricultural surplus, which is a blessing, right? It leads to granaries and then pottery. But remember Jesus' words to the farmer, the rich farmer, you fool, you've not been rich toward God. These people had a chance as the first city to change the world around them. And instead, let's put another row of stones on the wall. Let's tighten things up a little bit, maybe a military conscription and so on. So even as human beings are advancing technologically, human beings are advancing in many ways from a society, specialization of labor. Not everybody has to work quite so hard. That gets turned to basically negative things. That becomes, in its own way, our material entanglement. The walls built potentially to hold out floods are simply, they suddenly become a lot more effective at holding out people, right? And exercising control. But Jericho's position controlling trade routes makes it a target of envy. It's the rich people up there, right? And so if you can put enough folks together from your side, that's why Jericho, as well fortified as it is, and considering they literally built on bedrock, it gets broken down a fair amount. I'm not sure which civilizations ever looked at it and said, "No, we can't break in there." For love of what was inside, no matter what it took, we're breaking down those walls, and yet they kept building new ones. Jericho's wealth becomes a foundation for class societies, but that self-sufficiency leads the city to a religious cult worship, as best we understand it, to ensure harvest for their own wealth. And God uses Jericho to serve as examples of his power and justice, but through Jesus, he comes back to Jericho to heal, inspire, save, and break the relationship between greed and love of God. There is where we are. Next week, we take it to the next level. Sumer and the rise of the city-states, Babel and brick. Probably the most important invention after agriculture, when people realize that if the fire is hot enough, the brick will be waterproof. And so it won't melt in the rain anymore. And that's going to inspire massive cities. And we'll be talking about hundreds of thousands of people, and sewage systems and street planning and wonderful, beautiful civilizations that will invent writing and so many other things, and then use all those gifts of God to turn against each other. In a horrible way, that's going to basically end up losing 2,000 years of human development. But at the same time, it's going to lead to Abraham and God's promise and first covenant since Noah that will lead us down the path of redemption. That's all we have for tonight. Thank you. I can actually have time for a few questions if you'd like, but I'm going to turn off the recording.